Hey guys, this is actually just going to be a quick guys. This is actually just going to be a quick video to talk about uh, why just copying the best ranks on Warcraft logs is not the best thing to do in a progression setting, or it's not always the best thing to do. So what you're going to look at here is the class ranking of what is good on Side and Athos on Mythic, and then what you can see here is it's essentially a ranking of how good you are at burst AoE. Starting with Frost DK, I mean Havoc Demon Hunter is apparently third, despite the fact that Havoc is arguably the worst, if not one of the worst, if not the worst DPS class in the game right now. Unholy DK, Survival Hunters are quite high because they have very good uncapped AoE. Fire Mages, Windwalker Monks, Red Pally, so you can look at the list yourself. You can see as you go down, you start to get the single target oriented specs at the bottom. Exception being Affliction, just because they are easily the best DPS in the game right now. They have a bonkers good single target and multi-target profile, and they even do a decent bit of burst AoE. So they don't get left so far behind on phase 1 that they look bad on the overall. But that's essentially what we're talking about here, is class's ability to blast in phase 1. And the simple truth you guys need to realize is that not everyone can rank simultaneously. You can take the talent choices of the guy that, you can go and look at, oh, I'm a Marks Hunter, I'm going to look at what the absolute best Marks Hunters are doing, and I'm going to go, okay, this is what the top 100 Marks Hunters did on Warcraft logs for Side and Athos, so I'm just going to copy it. But what you're looking at is the guys who were specced into the ability to do the most burst AoE, and then were allowed to get that AoE by their guild, because you can't have 14 DPS all claiming the lion's share of that AoE damage in order to rank. Generally speaking, one or two players get it all. They rank and everyone else ranks badly because they didn't get it. And that's just how it works. So tunneling logs and chasing orange numbers next to your name is a recipe for disaster in this sort of situation. A good way to kind of demonstrate this is you look at affliction logs. You can look at their talent choices of the top 100 and their soulbind choices. You can look at it here too, and you trinket choices. You won't see a lot of change. The legendary is the same as well. And if you set this damage to bosses, it's going to be pretty much the same, because AF just in this fight just generally runs the one build, and it's the build that happens to give them the most single target damage, and it also happens to give them the most damage in other ways as well. So it's the overall best build to run, and you could go into these logs and investigate that and prove that. So on the flip side of that, you've got Marks Hunters, right? This is a really good example of exactly what I'm talking about. So Marks Hunters can either run the volley based build, or they can run whatever the other talent is, a single target talent that row is called, and everything kind of flows out of that. So you're going to look at here and you're going to see what the ranks are. Well, the ranks are people running Wild Hunt and First Strike, because that allows them to do really high AoE damage. Right? So all the ads come out and they just blow them up and they get a ton of damage. That's what all the ranks are going to be for Marks Hunters. However, that's not necessarily the most useful thing to do in a progression setting. Because you've got to think, right? Do you want to try and do the most overall damage on a boss where we have to do stop DPS phase 1, stop DPS in phase 2? Or do you want to focus your damage on what's going to help us get the kill, which in the case of Denathrius, would have been to maximize your phase 3 damage, because we didn't need more damage in phase 1 and phase 2. So what you can do is you can look at their damage to bosses, and you're also not going to see a lot of change. And you go, okay, that must mean this is the best overall, right? Does the most damage to bosses, does the most damage overall. This must be the best build. That's what I said about Affliction Warlock, right? Well, no, and that's just because we don't have the option here to look at specific parts of the fight. So, I mean, to just use the example of our hunters. So this is the damage from our kill, Side and Athos Mythic, and Whack is doing pretty decent, and Priya's low because he died in quite early in phase 3. But normally Whack and Priya are some of the on the upper distribution of our damage deals. And you can look at their damage to bosses, and you'll be like, these guys are doing pretty good. Their damage to bosses are pretty good. But if you set the to phase 3, you see their boss damage is quite low. Now, both of them are running a more single target oriented build on our kill than they were for the majority of progression, because that's one of the things we fixed before our last night. But both of them are quite low on DOS damage, and you can go back and look at other logs, and there we are. 4.5 is decent for Waka here, but they were both being like 4, maybe even lower than that on previous nights when we were doing like 1-2% wipes, and that sort of stuff matters in those situations, because they were running the build that made them look the best on overall, but they weren't running the build that allowed them to do the most damage in the part of the fight that mattered. So this is a really good example of why just going to Warcraft logs and being like, oh, I'm just going to copy this without thinking is a bad idea. If they'd done, both of them had done more investigation into what was going to help them do the most damage in the part of the fight that mattered, then they would have done a lot better. And other people were making similar mistakes. So this brings me to the next part of the video, which I wanted to talk about, which kind of plays on from the first part. So what I was getting at in the first part is that some classes have a better damage profile than other classes, right? So if your class can do really high single target damage and really high AoE damage, then that class is going to be broken. It's going to be really good. If your class has to choose between doing really good single target damage or really good AoE damage, then that class is in a problem. Because a really good example is what we just looked at. So with marksmanship hunters, you could choose to spec into multi-target in order to do more AoE and get a lot more damage on the ads in phase 1, make yourself look better on overall, etc., etc. However, the correct thing to do is to choose to spec into single target and allow the classes like Ret Paladins and Windwalkers and Unholy Decays and who can just do that AoE as a part of their natural damage niche, as part of their natural class damage profile, because they don't have to lose anything to do it. They just get it. And so what you're doing is you're losing something. You're losing some single target damage in order to take AoE damage away from classes who can just naturally do it without having to sacrifice anything in order to make yourself look better on overall. And that's bad for our rate. Now, there may be times early in prog when you want to do that, because when we're trying to learn phase 1, it's a good example. We want everyone to just be like blasting AoE to kill those ads so we can learn phase 1. But once we get comfortable in phase 1, you need to not do that anymore. You need to just let the classes, let the DKs of the world just epidemic their way to victory, because it's just a part of their class. They can do that. They don't have to sacrifice anything. And you need to focus on keeping your single target damage up, because what I want to talk about now is damage niches, okay? And boss damage, single target damage to bosses is always the most valuable kind of damage that you can do. And this is what generally controls what is meta in World of Warcraft. If your class can do a large amount of boss damage, it's useful. If your class can do a large amount of boss damage and other kinds of damage simultaneously, then you're going to be brought to world first shit, because you're really, really good. If your class has underwhelming boss damage, you're very unlikely to make it into a raid, even if you can do other things well, because at the end of the day, you still have to be able to do the boss damage. And the hardest part of every fight is always a single target burn. So being good at AoE doesn't actually really help as much as you think. So, I mean, you can look at the overall distribution for classes in Nathria, and your boomkins look really good. Yep, okay. Fire mages look really good. Okay. Ellie shamans look really good, but at the end of the day, no one's bringing Ellie shamans. No one's being like, man, I wish we had more Ellie shamans. Fire mages are really good inside of their niche, which is that they do extremely high burst damage on a 1-minute damage profile, which is absolutely mental. It's actually so good, even though their overall damage might not be as desirable as, say, an Affliction Warlock. Their ability to just be like, okay, anytime anything spawns that needs to die, we can combust on it. That is like incredibly valuable, and it was like really annoying that we only had one Mage's tier. Balance Stewards look like the overall best class. Why wouldn't you want a lot of Balance Stewards? Well, the reality is outside of spread cleave environments, balance is significantly weaker than most other ranged. That's not to say they're bad, right? But like if you have the choice of, do I want an Affliction Warlock? Do I want a Shadow Priest? Do I want another Mage? Because Balance Stewards do really good burst as well, but only when they can CA Convoke, which is a much longer cooldown than Fire Mage, who can combust every minute. For Denathrius, were we missing a second Balance Steward? I mean, yeah, if we had a second Balance Steward, it would have made phase 2 a lot easier to kill those big guys. But if we had more mages, that actually would have been better to kill those big ads. But all the rest of these classes, it's like Windwalker looks pretty decent overall. It's like a solid middle of pack spec, not too far away from Fury Warrior, which I also play. So they're pretty okay. They're not really that much of a burden. Ret Pallies, middle of the pack, whatever. And then as you get down here to the lesser played specs, they start to look worse simply because, and Destruction Walk's a great example. No one's playing Destruction. All the good players are playing AF. Therefore, the players who are left over who are playing Destruction are not as good, and therefore they look worse overall. It also means it's easier to rank. So if if you want to rank really well, what you want to do is you want to be a good player on an underplayed class, like our Danger constantly rank ones on the Feral, because no one plays Feral. But if you put it to damage to bosses, you're going to see exactly what I'm talking about. So easily these 3 classes here, and I would actually throw Feral Druid in here as well. I think Feral Druid's underrated. I think Feral Druid's like a budget assassination rogue. It's like a rogue without a cloak. But these 3 classes, 4 if you want to include Feral, are just crazy good at single target damage. And these are the things that are going to be the most valuable. So classes like Unholy DKs, also really good at single target damage, and more importantly, they also have the Execute, so they're really good at single target damage in the last part of the fight. And that makes them really valuable. And they can also carry the AoE for you. So while you've got your Affliction Warlocks and your Shadow Priest, you can't do much AoE. You bring a couple of Unholy DKs, they're going to blast single target, and they're also going to carry your AoE for you. Balance Druids fall off a lot when you look at it, and this is over all bosses, right? So this is really coarse. You can definitely point out some situations where Balance Druids have really good single target, and they do have really good single target, but they're generally weaker for the important things. Like, for example, if you look at last phase to Nathrius, Balance Druid shouldn't be winning. They shouldn't be carrying. What should be carrying are your rogues, your priests, your Warlocks, and your Feral Druids. Warriors fall off a ton. Windwalker falls off a lot. Like Windwalker's bottom of the barrel when it comes to boss damage. So it's big credit to Scuff he does as well as he does. Fury Warrior has a bit of a caveat here, like you put a star next to it, and that's that their execute damage is really quite high, and you can look at our damage from Denathrius. So when in an execution sense, Fury actually comes up to the top. Like it's never going to beat the top 4 I've been talking about, but it's a really solid contributor, I reckon, on par with Unholy DK. And that's the thing what we're talking about there with damage niches. And this is why like classes who have to make a choice between what they're going to do kind of suck. Like if you have to choose whether you're going to do really good single target damage or you're going to do really good AoE damage, you're just going to be uncompetitive compared to classes that can just do that shit with their innate skill set. But if you are playing one of those classes, you need to just stop copying logs, because when you're like a class that has to choose between single target damage and AoE damage, all the logs are going to be the people who chose AoE damage. All the higher ranks are going to be people who chose AoE damage and then just blasted AoE on their way to victory. But that is not what's going to help us in a progression setting. If you're one of those classes that has to choose, you need to choose single target and just let the classes that can innately do high AoE as a part of their baseline skill set get all the AoE and look great on the meter, and accept that you're going to be at the bottom of the meter. And just to close this concept, I want to talk about why Destruction Warlock is garbage. And on the flip side, just why Destruction Warlock is amazing. And that's because Destruction Warlock kind of epitomizes what we're talking about here in terms of niches, right? So Destruction Warlock can only be insanely good or shit. And that is because it all comes back to their ability to do single target damage. So Destruction Warlock often looks much better on overall than it really is. And that's because its ability to do multi-target damage is very high. It's got a very strong 2-target cleave niche with Havoc, and its Cataclysm is really strong, and it's got the AoE that Infernals do is really strong, and they just have this ability to look really strong on overall damage. They often make a very low contribution to your success as a raid group, which makes them undesirable to bring. And that's because their single target damage is usually pretty low. And the flip side of this is Destruction Warlocks are absolutely amazing when the single target damage is high. And that does happen on occasion. A good example is Nihilotha, when they got all that haste. Their single target damage was really, really good. And then you have all that extra stuff on top of that. So you think about it. If Destruction looks competitive when it can be havocing onto 2 targets reliably and it can be AoEing, imagine how good they look once they do legitimately good single target damage. They go from being competitive to being bonkers level broken. Like their single target damage is high enough that it's considered good, desirable even. Like you want to bring them for their single target damage. And then as soon as they can start havocing on top of that, their damage just goes fucking through the roof. They turn that dial up to 11. And this is a damage niche that is impossible to balance because you're only going to live in this world where they don't do very good single target damage, and thus, whilst they look good and overall, they don't really help you on the parts of the fight that are actually hard, and therefore they're undesirable to bring. Or the single target damage is so high that all the other shit they do with Havoc and the AoE is just gravy on top of that, and it pushes them into levels of absolute insanity. So, I mean, we just saw this on Denathrius, and if we wanted to, we could go back and we could look at it and we could say, yeah, like over a lot of pools, Destruction Warlocks do a ton of damage in phase 1. They do really good damage in phase 2 because they can use their Havoc on the Cabbalists when they're damage amped. So as soon as the racking pain goes off, you can drop a Havoc and you can drop fucking 3 Chaos Bolts into these debuffed Cabbalists, and like your damage is really, really good. But they get to phase 3, there's a ton of movement, which is already really bad for them. And they already don't do very good single target damage, and they just fall in the bin, and they don't help you on that hard part of the fight. So they look good early in prog when you're trying to push phase 1. You want lots of people to do AoE, so you can kill those ads, learn phase 1, then you get into phase 2. Same deal. You want people to do really good damage, you can get through phase 2, learn phase 2. But eventually you get to this point where you're doing stop damage in phase 1, you're doing stop damage in phase 2. Damage in those phases doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't help you kill the boss. What does help you is the damage in the last phase, and they can't help you with that. And this is really typical of end bosses. This is why Destruction is in such a precarious place. Is that end bosses are almost always designed like this, and end bosses are also the hardest bosses, obviously. So you can look at Eternal Palace, right? Let's look at Ashara, Queen Ashara Mythic. You can see some Destruction Warlocks ranking in there. Oh, if you remember Ashara, you got phase 1, 2 target cleave. Phase 2, AoE on the ads that spawn. And then phase 3 and phase 4 are single target. Okay, well, they look really good on overall because of just how much damage they can do in phase 1 and phase 2. They do so much damage in phase 1 and phase 2 that that carries them for the rest of the fight, and on overall they look okay. So we can go to the stats here, and for Queen Ashara, and you can see Destruction not so good. They kind of sit middle of the pack. But there's some ranks where they just absolutely blast in those earlier phases, and it carries them. And then when you put it onto damage to bosses, it looks even worse for them. Look how far down they are. And if you were to take this damage to bosses even further and actually go into the logs and only look at the damage for phase 3 and phase 4, when they can only hit 1 or 2 targets, I mean, there's a little bit of havoc potential in phase 3, but not so much because of line of sight. And then phase 4 is, of course, just pure single target. If you were to go and look at their contribution in phase 4 and phase 3, they would be even lower. They'd be like bottom of the barrel. Yet they're still able to rank because of how much damage they can do in the earlier phases. It's really misleading. It makes the class look good when it's not. Same thing with Jaina. Look at all of these ranks here. So it's Battle Desire Lord, Jaina Paramore. And again, if you don't remember Jaina, you've got phase 1, those little ads that spawn, you can havoc onto, get flashpoint procs off of whatever. Phase 2, you've got the barrels that we break, and they can be hit before they're broken. And that means you can be proccing flashpoint, you can be havocing onto them to get those stacks of intellect from whatever that was that did that right. So you could do a ton of damage in phase 1 and phase 2 because of the havoc stuff. And then you get to phase 3, and again, the damage goes in the toilet. So, look at these ranks. Really, really looking good on this. Go to stats. Mork, second best. Ellie Shaman, best. Destruction, Mork, second best, Go to damage to bosses. And Demonology and Affliction, really good. Because Demonology had that really good damage profile for last phase Ashara, last phase Jaina, because it was around about 2 minutes. They had 1.5 minute cooldowns, I think. Anyway, there's something about Demonology where they just get a second use of their cooldown that last phase, which pushed them over the edge. to be better than AF. They were also crazy good in Battle of Zaralor. And where's Destruction? Destruction is down here. And again, this is their overall damage to bosses. This counts the extra damage to the bosses they're getting in Phase 1 and Phase 2 from the Flashpoint proc and stuff they're getting from being able to hit additional targets. If you were to go into these logs and look at where they actually sit in the last part of the phase, the hardest part of the boss, they'd be down here. So this is what I'm talking about when certain classes can look good on overall, but they're not actually good because they don't help you in the parts of the fight that are hard. So to emphasize this, we're talking about damage niches. The most important damage niche is single target. That's why Danger, who plays Feral, it's a niche class that no one uses, but he's never been a burden to us. In fact, he often helps us. He often carries us because we get to that hard part of the fight. It's single target, and he shreds. All right. Compare that to a niche class like what Lady is playing with Destruction. And this is not to flame her, it's just that Destruction, this is the truth. This is just how the game works. Destruction is just undesirable at the moment because their single target damage is too low. And if that was ever to switch, and their single target damage was actually quite good, Destruction would just be mental. It'd be the best spec in the game, and every Warlock would be playing it. We'd have like 4 Destruction Warlocks because it would just be so strong. Because it sits in a space where there's no in between. They're either really good or they're really bad.